I died loving him. I was reborn hating myself for it. And when I finally walked away, he shattered like glass in the rain, taking her down with him. But by then, it was already too late for all of us. The clock on my nightstand read 3:47 a.m. when I opened my eyes to this second chance at life. The same cherry blossom wallpaper. The same cramped apartment that smelled of instant coffee and broken dreams. The same reflection in the mirror, 22 years old, dark circles under my eyes, wearing that ridiculous oversized sweater he once said made me look like a lost child. Except this time, I remembered everything. Every pathetic text message. Every ignored phone call. Every time I waited outside his apartment building in the rain, hoping he'd notice me through his window. Every humiliating moment of my previous life crashed down on me like a tidal wave, and I wanted to scream until my lungs collapsed. In my first life, I had been Arya Chen, the girl who chased shadows and called them love. I had been the one who waited 3 hours at cafes for dates that never showed up. I had been the one who made excuses for his cruelty, who turned his indifference into romantic mystery, who convinced myself that his coldness was just a wall I needed to break down with enough patience and devotion. I had been pathetic. I had been desperate. I had been everything I swore I'd never become, all for Kai Nakamura, a man who looked at me like I was a stain on his perfect world. The memories of my death were crystal clear now. I had been rushing to his office building, clutching a homemade bento box and wearing the blue dress he'd complimented once 2 years prior, when the truck ran the red light. In those final moments, as the world spun and darkness crept in, my last coherent thought hadn't been about my family or my dreams or the life I was leaving behind. It had been about him. About whether he'd miss me. About whether he'd finally realize what he'd lost. Even dying, I had made it about Kai, and the shame of that realization burned through me like acid. But here I was, breathing and alive and 22 again, with all the knowledge of how this story ended. I knew that in 3 months, he would meet Yuki Sato at a company conference. I knew she would be everything I wasn't, effortlessly elegant, quietly confident, the kind of woman who never had to chase because others naturally gravitated toward her. I knew he would fall for her like a man jumping off a cliff, completely and irreversibly. I knew that Yuki would become his girlfriend, then his fiancée, then his wife. I knew that I would spend the remaining years of my first life watching their happiness from the sidelines, convincing myself that if I just tried harder, loved him more purely, sacrificed more of myself, he would eventually see me. The phone on my nightstand buzzed. A text message. From him. My heart did that traitorous flutter before my mind caught up and reminded me what this was. What this had always been. I picked up the phone with steady hands, already knowing what I would find. Hey. Can you cover my shift at the bookstore tomorrow? Something came up. No please. No thank you in advance. No acknowledgement that I had covered for him 6 times in the past 2 months. Just expectation wrapped in casual indifference. In my previous life, I had responded within minutes, eagerly agreeing and asking if everything was okay. I had spent the entire next day wondering about his mysterious something and whether I could somehow help. This time, I set the phone aside and went back to sleep. The next morning brought a series of increasingly urgent messages. First confusion, then annoyance, then something that almost resembled concern. By the time I finally responded 12 hours later with a simple, I can't, the damage to his expectations was already done. I could practically feel his confusion through the screen, and it filled me with a dark satisfaction I wasn't proud of but couldn't deny. The bookstore where we both worked part-time was a narrow, dusty space wedged between a ramen shop and a laundromat. It smelled like old paper and the jasmine tea our manager Mrs. Huang brewed constantly. I had loved working there in my first life, mainly because it meant hours of stolen glances at Kai as he restocked shelves or helped customers. Now, walking through those doors felt like entering a museum of my own pathetic history. Every corner held a memory of my former desperation. The poetry section where I'd lingered hoping he'd recommend something to me. The register where I'd fumbled with change while trying to make conversation. The break room where I'd eaten lunch alone, watching him through the window as he smoked cigarettes and checked his phone. He was there when I arrived, of course. Tall and lean, with that carelessly perfect black hair that always looked like he'd just run his fingers through it. He wore the same vintage band t-shirt and dark jeans that had once made my heart race. Now, looking at him felt like staring at a photograph of a stranger. Someone I used to know. Someone I used to think I loved. "You didn't answer my calls," he said without looking up from the inventory sheet he was pretending to care about. "I was busy." The lie sat easily on my tongue. In my previous life, I would have launched into elaborate apologies and explanations, desperate to smooth over any ripple in our non-relationship. This time, I simply walked past him to clock in, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne without feeling that old desperate longing. It was remarkable how different everything looked when you weren't viewing it through the lens of unrequited obsession. Busy with what? There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. A note of actual curiosity rather than his usual polite dismissal. It made me pause, and for a moment I felt that familiar flutter of hope rising in my chest. Then I remembered where hope had gotten me. I remembered the truck. I remembered dying with his name on my lips. Personal things. I could feel his eyes on me as I tied my apron and began straightening the display near the entrance. Romance novels, ironically. Their pastel covers promised happy endings and love that conquered all obstacles. In my first life, I had secretly believed in those promises. I had thought that if I just loved hard enough, purely enough, desperately enough, I could transform myself into the heroine of my own love story. Now I knew better. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some love is just elaborate self-destruction dressed up in pretty words. The morning passed quietly. I helped customers, restocked shelves, and organized the children's section while Kai handled the register and occasionally shot confused glances in my direction. I could feel his confusion building like pressure in a closed system, and I found myself curious about when it would finally explode. In my previous life, I had been so focused on gaining his attention that I'd never really observed him as a person. I'd never noticed the way he tapped his fingers against his thigh when he was thinking, or how he always checked his reflection in the security monitor, or the fact that he seemed genuinely uncomfortable when customers asked for book recommendations because he rarely read anything besides music magazines and social media. It was almost disappointing, really. The man I had built up in my mind as some mysterious, complex figure was actually quite ordinary. Handsome, yes, but ordinary in all the ways that mattered. He liked surface-level things and surface-level people. He craved attention but had no idea how to handle genuine emotion. He was the kind of person who looked good in photographs but had nothing interesting to say during the actual conversation. How had I never seen this before? How had I convinced myself that his emotional unavailability was depth rather than simple shallowness? "Are you okay?" he asked during our lunch break, and I realized I had been staring at him with what must have looked like pity. "I'm fine." "You're acting weird." "Am I?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was used to me hanging on his every word, analyzing his moods, adjusting my behavior to match his energy. This new version of me, calm, detached, uninterested in performing for his approval, clearly didn't fit into any category he understood. "Yeah, you are. You're being distant." "I'm being normal." "This isn't normal for you." The honesty in that statement was brutal. He was right, of course. Normal for me had been pathetic. Normal had been desperate. Normal had been a performance of femininity designed to make myself smaller, more palatable, more worthy of scraps of his attention. I had spent so much energy trying to be the girl he might eventually want that I had completely lost track of who I actually was underneath all that desperate performing. "Maybe I'm changing," I said, and watched something flicker across his face that might have been concern or might have been annoyance. It was hard to tell with Kai. Everything about him was surface level, including his emotions. That afternoon, Yuki Sato walked into the bookstore for the first time. I knew it was her immediately, even though this was 3 months earlier than their meeting was supposed to happen. She was exactly as I remembered from my previous life, willowy and elegant, with long straight hair and the kind of effortless beauty that looked good in any lighting. She wore a simple white blouse and dark jeans, but somehow made them look like they belonged in a magazine. She moved through the store with the quiet confidence of someone who had never had to chase anyone for anything. I watched Kai notice her from across the store. I watched his posture change, his shoulders straightening and his hands unconsciously smoothing down his hair. I watched him find an excuse to walk past the fiction section where she was browsing, and I watched her glance up and smile, not the desperate, eager smile I used to give him, but something small and genuine and completely unconscious of its own power. In my previous life, I had hated her. I had convinced myself she was manipulative, calculating, stealing something that rightfully belonged to me. Now, watching her select a book and approach the counter where Kai was practically vibrating with nervous energy, I felt something unexpected. Sympathy. She had no idea what she was walking into. She had no idea that loving Kai Nakamura was like trying to hold water in your bare hands. The tighter you gripped, the faster it slipped away. Their conversation was painfully ordinary. She wanted to buy a novel. He recommended something he probably hadn't read. She smiled and thanked him. He asked if she was new to the neighborhood. She said she'd just moved here for work. He said he'd lived here all his life. She said it seemed like a nice area. The whole interaction took maybe 3 minutes, but I could see it replaying behind his eyes for the rest of the afternoon. He was hooked, just like before, just like he was always going to be. "Do you know her?" he asked me after she left, trying to sound casual and failing completely. "No. She seemed nice." "Did she?" He frowned at my lack of enthusiasm. In my previous life, I would have encouraged him to ask her out, convinced that supporting his happiness would somehow make him love me in return. I would have helped him craft the perfect text message, given him advice on where to take her for their first date, smiled and nodded while my heart broke into smaller and smaller pieces. This time, I just shrugged and went back to organizing the poetry section. "You really are acting weird," he said, but there was something different in his voice now. Something that sounded almost like worry. That evening, I walked home through the same streets I had walked 1,000 times in my previous life. The same convenience store on the corner, the same apartment building with laundry hanging from every balcony, the same park where teenagers skateboard until security chased them away. But everything felt different now. Emptier, somehow. Less urgent. In my first life, these streets had been charged with possibility. Every step had been taken with the hope that I might run into Kai, might have some chance encounter that would finally make him see me as more than just the desperate girl who worked at the bookstore with him. Now I knew the truth. There would be no chance encounters. There would be no sudden realization of my hidden depths. There would be no moment where he looked at me and finally understood that I was the one who had been there all along. Those things only happened in the romance novels we sold to lonely women who wanted to believe in magic. My apartment felt different too. In my previous life, it had been a shrine to my obsession with Kai. Photos of us together, well, photos of group outings where we happened to be in the same frame, covered my refrigerator. I had saved every text message he'd ever sent me, screenshotted every social media post where he'd appeared, collected memories like evidence that something real existed between us. Now, looking around at the same space with clear eyes, I felt embarrassed by my own delusion. I spent that first night of my new life throwing things away. The concert ticket stub from a show we'd attended with mutual friends, a show where he'd spent the entire evening talking to other women while I stood beside him pretending not to care. The coffee cup from a cafe where we'd once shared a table, though shared was generous, since I had engineered the encounter by showing up when I knew he'd be there and casually asking if I could sit down. The book of poetry I'd bought because he'd mentioned liking one particular poet, a book I'd forced myself to read and love even though I found it pretentious and boring. Every object I discarded felt like shedding skin. Like becoming someone new. Like waking up from a dream that had lasted so long I'd forgotten it wasn't real. The changes started small. I stopped checking his social media obsessively. I stopped timing my breaks to coincide with his. I stopped wearing the colors he'd complimented and the perfume he'd once said smelled nice. I stopped laughing at his mediocre jokes and nodding along with his half-formed opinions about books he hadn't read and movies he'd only half-watched. At first, he didn't seem to notice. He was too distracted by Yuki's periodic visits to the bookstore. She came in every few days, always buying something, always polite and friendly without being overly encouraging. I could see him building up the courage to ask her out, the same way I could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It was inevitable and obvious and painful to watch. But as the days turned into weeks, his confusion about my behavior began to crystallize into something more urgent. He started asking me direct questions about my weekend plans, my mood, my thoughts on things that had never interested him before. He began complaining about customers and work situations, clearly expecting the sympathy and validation I had always provided. When I responded with neutral politeness instead of eager concern, I could see him becoming more and more agitated. "Are you mad at me about something?" he asked one afternoon when we were alone in the store. "No." "Then why are you being so cold?" The accusation stung, mainly because it was so unfair. I wasn't being cold. I was simply being normal. I was treating him the way he had always treated me, with polite friendliness but no particular investment in his emotional state. The fact that this felt cold to him said everything about how much emotional labor I had been providing without ever being asked. I'm not being cold. I'm just not being desperate anymore. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I watched his face change. Surprise first, then something that looked like hurt, then that familiar shut-down expression he always wore when conversations got too real. "I never asked you to be desperate. You never asked me to stop, either." We stared at each other across the narrow aisle between the bestsellers and the local authors, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes that looked almost like recognition. Like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Like he was understanding something he had been carefully not understanding for far too long. But then Yuki walked through the door, and whatever moment we might have been having evaporated like morning mist. His attention shifted to her so completely and immediately that I might as well have become invisible. In my previous life, this would have devastated me. I would have spent hours analyzing every word of our conversation, wondering if I had said too much or not enough, crafting the perfect follow-up text message to smooth over the tension. This time, I just felt tired. I watched him help her find a cookbook, watched him recommend the cafe down the street where she could try some of the recipes, watched her smile and thank him and mention that she'd never been there but had heard good things. I watched him offer to show her sometime, watched her consider the invitation with the careful calculation of someone who wasn't desperate but wasn't entirely uninterested either. I watched the whole choreography of early attraction play out exactly as it had in my previous life, except this time I was watching from outside the story instead of desperately trying to insert myself into it. They had their first date 3 days later. I only knew because he called in sick to work with a transparent lie about food poisoning, and I saw the photos on his social media that evening. The two of them at the cafe he'd recommended, sharing a piece of cake, looking comfortable and happy in that easy way that people do when they're genuinely enjoying each other's company. In my previous life, those photos had been like daggers to my heart. This time, they just made me feel empty. Not sad, exactly. Just hollow, like looking at photos of strangers living a life that had nothing to do with me. It should have been a relief. I should have been celebrating my freedom from the obsession that had consumed my entire previous existence. But instead, I felt unmoored. For so long, wanting Kai had been the organizing principle of my life. Every decision I made, every outfit I chose, every book I read, every opinion I formed had been filtered through the lens of what might make him see me, want me, love me. Without that constant, desperate longing, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. The bookstore became unbearable. Not because of my feelings for Kai, those had died the night I was reborn, but because of his feelings for me. Now that I had stopped chasing him, he seemed to be noticing my absence in a way he had never noticed my presence. He lingered near my section when helping customers. He asked my opinion on things he had never cared about before. He brought me coffee in the morning and seemed genuinely confused when I thanked him politely but without the breathless gratitude he was clearly expecting. "Are you seeing someone?" he asked one day, apropos of nothing. "No." "Oh." He seemed to be waiting for more information, but I didn't provide it. In my previous life, I would have used this question as an opportunity to hint about my feelings for him, to let him know I was available and interested. This time, I just restocked the true crime section and let the silence stretch between us. "I'm seeing someone," he offered after a few minutes. "That's nice. Her name is Yuki. She's really great. Good for you." I could feel his frustration building. He wanted me to ask questions, to show interest, to perform the role of supportive friend that I had always played. He wanted to tell me about their dates, their conversations, the way she made him feel. In my previous life, I would have listened with a smile on my face and a knife in my heart, offering advice and encouragement while slowly dying inside. This time, I just felt tired. "Don't you want to hear about her?" "Not particularly." The honesty seemed to shock him. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I had never refused to be his emotional dumping ground before. I had never declined to help him process his feelings about other women. I had never treated his romantic life like something that was none of my business. "But we're friends," he said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice. "Are we?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I hadn't meant to be cruel, but I realized that was exactly how it sounded. The truth was, we had never been friends. Friends were equals. Friends cared about each other's lives and feelings and experiences. Our entire relationship had been built on my desperate performance of devotion and his comfortable acceptance of that devotion. I had been his audience, his cheerleader, his emotional support system. He had been my obsession. Neither of us had ever tried to know the other as an actual person. "Of course we are," he said, but he sounded uncertain now. "When's my birthday, Kai?" The question caught him completely off guard. I watched him struggle to remember, watched realization dawn across his face that he didn't know. In 3 years of working together, 3 years of me organizing my entire life around his presence, he had never once remembered my birthday. I, of course, had memorized his. I had bought him gifts he'd accepted with polite confusion. I had baked him cakes he'd eaten without comment. I had celebrated his existence while remaining invisible in my own right. He started to speak, then stopped. There was nothing he could say. We both knew he didn't know. "March 15th, I said quietly. 3 weeks from now. I'll be 23. The shame on his face was almost worth the years of humiliation. Almost. I quit the bookstore the next day. I didn't give 2 weeks' notice or explain my reasoning or try to make it easy for anyone. I simply walked in, told Mrs. Huang I was done, and walked out. It felt like stepping out of a burning building. Like finally being able to breathe. Kai called me 6 times that day. I didn't answer. He sent increasingly frantic text messages asking what was wrong, where I was going, whether this was about him. The last message, sent at 2:17 a.m., simply said, "I'm sorry." I deleted it without responding. I found a new job at a small gallery across town. The pay was better, the work was more interesting, and none of my co-workers had ever seen me at my most pathetic. I rented a different apartment, in a different neighborhood, with different streets and different coffee shops and different memories. I cut my hair short and bought new clothes in colors Kai had never seen me wear. I started reading books I actually wanted to read and listening to music I actually enjoyed and having opinions that weren't filtered through the lens of what might make me more appealing to someone who had never been interested in the first place. It should have been a new beginning. It should have been freedom. And in many ways, it was. But there was something hollow about it too. Something that felt less like healing and more like numbness. I had spent so much time defining myself in opposition to my previous desperation that I wasn't sure who I was when I wasn't actively trying to be someone else. The gallery was a peaceful place to work. Clean white walls, carefully curated art, the kind of hushed atmosphere that made people speak in whispers. My job was simple: greet visitors, answer basic questions, keep the space pristine. Most days passed quietly, with only a handful of people wandering through to look at the rotating exhibitions. It was exactly the kind of environment where I could disappear into my own thoughts, which was both a blessing and a curse. I thought about Kai more than I wanted to admit. Not with the old desperate longing, but with a kind of detached curiosity about how his story was unfolding. I found myself wondering if he was happy with Yuki, if he ever thought about me, if he had learned anything from my sudden absence. Sometimes I caught myself checking his social media, scrolling through photos of their relationship milestones, official couple photos, vacation pictures, the gradual integration into each other's friend groups. They looked happy. They looked like they belonged together in a way that he and I never had. 3 months after I quit the bookstore, I ran into Mrs. Huang at the grocery store. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, which was more than I had expected. "How are you doing, dear? We've missed you at the store." "I'm doing well. How's business?" "Same as always. Though Kai hasn't been quite the same since you left. He asks about you sometimes." Something twisted in my chest at that, but I couldn't tell if it was satisfaction or regret. "He has a girlfriend now," I said, as if Mrs. Huang wouldn't already know this. "Yes, she's lovely. Very polite. But..." She paused, clearly debating whether to continue. "Sometimes I think he's comparing everyone to someone who isn't there anymore." I didn't know what to do with that information, so I filed it away with all the other things about Kai that I was trying not to think about. Mrs. Huang and I made polite conversation about the gallery and her grandchildren, and then we went our separate ways. But her words stayed with me, turning over and over in my mind like a song I couldn't get unstuck. 6 months after I left, Kai found me. I was locking up the gallery on a Thursday evening when I saw him standing across the street, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking like he'd been waiting for a while. My first instinct was to pretend I hadn't seen him, to slip out the back entrance and avoid whatever conversation he thought we needed to have. But something in his posture, defeated, almost vulnerable, made me curious despite myself. He crossed the street when he saw me notice him, and I was struck by how different he looked. Thinner, maybe. Definitely tired. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his usually perfect hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. "Hi," he said when he reached me. "Hi." We stood there on the sidewalk, two people who used to know each other, not sure how to begin. "I've been looking for you," he said finally. "Have you? You disappeared. I got a new job. And a new apartment. And a new phone number." I hadn't realized he tried to call me from a different number, but I wasn't surprised. Of course he had. In my previous life, his persistence would have felt romantic. Now it just felt exhausting. "Why were you looking for me, Kai?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see him struggling with something, some internal battle between what he wanted to say and what he thought he should say. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally. "For what?" For not noticing. For taking you for granted. For being a terrible friend." We weren't friends, I said, echoing our conversation from months ago. We were never friends. Then what were we? The question was so genuinely confused, so earnestly bewildered, that I almost felt sorry for him. How could someone be so completely unaware of their own impact on another person? How could you accept 3 years of devotion from someone and never once wonder what it meant to them? I was obsessed with you, I said, because there was no point in pretending anymore. And you were comfortable with that obsession because it made you feel good about yourself without requiring you to give anything back. He flinched like I'd slapped him. That's not. I didn't know. You knew. I didn't know it was that bad. You knew I was in love with you, Kai. You knew it, and you let me keep humiliating myself because it was easier than dealing with it directly. You knew, and you used it. The words came out harder than I'd intended, but they felt true. They felt like something I'd needed to say for years but had never had the courage to voice when it might have mattered. I never asked you to. No, you never asked. You never had to ask. I gave and gave and gave, and you just took it all like it was your due. Like I was some kind of vending machine that dispensed attention and emotional support whenever you needed it. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his shoes while people walked around us on the sidewalk. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes, and I felt that old familiar urge to comfort him, to take back my harsh words and make him feel better. But I didn't. I had spent too many years putting his emotional comfort ahead of my own truth. I'm sorry, he said, and this time it sounded like he meant it. I'm so sorry, Arya. I was selfish and stupid and I hurt you, and I'm sorry. Thank you. Can we try to be actual friends? Real friends? The hope in his voice was painful to hear. In my previous life, this conversation would have been everything I'd dreamed of. Kai acknowledging our relationship, wanting to rebuild it on better terms, looking at me with real emotion instead of polite indifference. But it was too late now. I had already mourned this friendship, this obsession, this version of myself that had needed his approval to feel whole. I don't think so, I said gently. I think we missed our chance for that. Because of Yuki? No. Because of me. Because I can't go back to being the person I was when I knew you. And I don't think you can handle me being anyone else. I could see him processing this, could see him trying to figure out if I was right. The old me would have waited for his response, would have given him time to argue or negotiate or convince me to change my mind. The new me simply said goodbye and walked away. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Kai would go back to his girlfriend and his life and his carefully constructed world where people loved him without expecting him to love them back. I thought I would continue building my new existence, free from the weight of wanting someone who couldn't want me in return. But life, I was learning, rarely unfolds the way we expect. 2 weeks later, Yuki came to the gallery. I recognized her immediately, of course. She looked exactly the same as she had in my previous life, elegant, composed, the kind of beautiful that photograph well and age gracefully. She wandered through the current exhibition for about 20 minutes, looking at each piece with genuine interest, before approaching my desk. Excuse me, she said, and her voice was exactly as I remembered it, soft, well-modulated, the kind of voice that never had to repeat itself to be heard. Are you Arya Chen? My stomach dropped. There was no reason she should know my name, no reason she should be here, no reason this conversation should be happening at all. Yes. I'm Yuki Sato. I think you know my boyfriend, Kai. Boyfriend. Not fiancé, like they had been at this point in my previous life. Something had changed. Something was different this time around. I used to work with him, I said carefully. Yes, he mentioned that. He talks about you sometimes. She said it without accusation or jealousy, just a simple statement of fact. In my previous life, I had imagined her as my rival, my enemy, the woman who had stolen my happy ending. Now, sitting across from her in the gallery's reception area, she just seemed like a person. A nice person who was probably about to have a very uncomfortable conversation. "What can I help you with?" She was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. "I think he's in love with you." The statement hit me like a physical blow. Not because it hurt, though it did, in ways I couldn't immediately process, but because it was so completely unexpected. In my previous life, Kai had never shown any sign of being conflicted about his feelings for Yuki. He had fallen for her completely and immediately, and I had been nothing more than a ghost haunting the edges of their love story. "I think you're mistaken," I said. "Maybe. But I don't think so." She leaned forward slightly, and I could see the pain she was trying to hide behind her composed expression. "He's been different ever since you left the bookstore. Distracted. Like he's always thinking about something else, someone else. And when he drinks too much, he talks about you. About how he didn't appreciate you when he had the chance. About how he was too stupid to see what was right in front of him." This was not the conversation I had expected to have today. Or ever. In my previous life, Yuki had been secure in Kai's affection, confident in their relationship, blissfully unaware of my existence as anything more than a former coworker he barely remembered. This version of her was different. Sadder. More fragile. "What do you want me to do about it?" I asked. "I want you to tell me if you're in love with him too." The honesty in her voice was devastating. She wasn't here to fight for her man or to mark her territory. She was here because she was in love with someone who was in love with someone else, and she wanted to understand the shape of her own heartbreak. "No," I said, and it was the truth. "I'm not." "But you were." "Yes. I was." "What changed?" How could I explain it? How could I tell her about dying and being reborn and watching your own desperation from the outside until you couldn't stand the sight of it anymore? How could I describe the process of falling out of love with someone you'd never really known in the first place? "I realized he wasn't worth it," I said finally. She flinched at that, and I immediately felt guilty. Whatever Kai's faults, she clearly loved him genuinely. She didn't deserve to have her feelings dismissed, even indirectly. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "That was cruel. He wasn't worth it to me, but that doesn't mean he's not worth it to you." "But if you wanted him back?" She began, and I could hear the fear in her voice. The certainty that she would lose, that she couldn't compete with the ghost of a love that had haunted Kai long enough to make him question everything else. "I don't," I said firmly. "I promise you, I don't want him back. I don't want any version of him, or any version of us. That part of my life is over." She studied my face for a long moment, looking for deception or hesitation. When she didn't find any, some of the tension went out of her shoulders. "He doesn't believe that," she said. "He thinks you're just angry, that you'll forgive him eventually. Then he doesn't know me at all." "No," she said quietly. "I don't think he does." We sat in silence for a few minutes, two women bound together by their shared experience of loving someone who was incapable of loving them back in the way they deserved. It was not the solidarity I had ever imagined having with Yuki, but it felt real in a way that most of my interactions these days didn't. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Sure." "How do you stop loving someone who doesn't deserve it?" The question broke my heart. Not for Kai, but for her. For both of us. For every woman who had ever found herself in love with a man who treated affection like a commodity and devotion like a given right. "You realize that the person you loved never really existed," I said. "You were in love with potential. With the idea of who he could become if he just tried harder, cared more, grew up. But potential isn't a person. It's a fantasy." She nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. "He keeps talking about changing, about becoming the man you deserved. But he's not actually changing. He's just sad about it. Sadness isn't transformation, I said. Regret isn't growth. And you can't love someone into becoming a better person. I know that. Her voice was barely a whisper. I know that, but I keep hoping anyway. Then you'll end up like I did. Dying with his name on your lips and nothing to show for it but wasted years. She looked at me sharply. Dying? I had said too much, but there was no taking it back now. Metaphorically speaking. You'll kill the person you could have been if you spend your life waiting for him to notice her. Yuki left that day with tears in her eyes and my words echoing between us. I thought that would be the end of it, that she would either find the strength to leave Kai or resign herself to loving someone who would always be looking over her shoulder for something he thought he'd lost. I was wrong. 3 days later, I was working late at the gallery when Kai appeared again. This time he didn't wait across the street or try to catch me at closing time. He walked straight through the front door like he belonged there, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been desperation. You talked to Yuki, he said without preamble. She came to see me. What did you tell her? The truth. Which was what, exactly? I could see he was trying to control himself, trying not to shout in the quiet space surrounded by expensive art. But his composure was cracking around the edges, and I found myself curious to see what lay underneath. That I don't love you anymore. That I don't want you back. That you're wasting your time pining for something that doesn't exist. You're lying. The certainty in his voice was almost impressive. He had constructed such an elaborate fantasy about my feelings, about our relationship, about the depth of connection we'd never actually shared. Now that fantasy was all he had left to cling to. She broke up with me, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. She said she couldn't compete with a ghost. She said I was in love with the idea of you, not her. She said I had turned you into some perfect woman who existed only in my regret. She was right. No, she wasn't. I know what I feel. I know what I've lost. What have you lost, Kai? I asked, and my voice was gentler than he deserved. Really? What exactly do you think you've lost? You. I lost you. You never had me. I had your love. I had your devotion. I had someone who cared about me more than anything else in the world, and I threw it away because I was too stupid to see what it was worth. And there it was. The truth he had been dancing around for months. He didn't miss me. He missed being worshipped. He didn't love me. He loved the idea of being loved unconditionally by someone who asked for nothing in return. Now that Yuki was gone and I was indifferent, he was finally feeling the cold reality of being alone with himself. That wasn't love, I said. That was obsession. That was me losing myself so completely in the fantasy of you that I forgot I was supposed to be a person too. You don't miss me, Kai. You miss having an audience for your existence. That's not true. Isn't it? When's the last time you asked yourself what I wanted? What I needed? What I dreamed about when I wasn't dreaming about you? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. We both knew he had never wondered about any of those things. I had been a supporting character in his story, never the protagonist of my own. I can change, he said desperately. I can be better. I can love you the way you deserve to be loved. I don't want your love, I said, and I meant it. I don't want your guilt or your regret or your belated appreciation. I don't want to be the woman you finally learned to value because you lost her. I want to be someone who was worth loving all along, and you never saw that person. Because I was an idiot. Because I was blind. But I see now. No, you don't. You see the absence of something you took for granted. That's not the same as seeing me. I watched him struggle with this, watched him try to find an argument that would make me change my mind. But there wasn't one. The person he thought he was in love with, the devoted girl who had waited for him and worshipped him and built her entire world around his fleeting attention, was gone. She had died in that truck accident, and I had been reborn as someone else entirely. "Please," he said, and the word was broken glass in his throat. "Please, Arya. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. Just give me one chance to prove that I can be different." "You want to prove you can be different? Then prove it with someone else. Learn to see people before you lose them. Learn to value what you have while you have it. Learn to love without taking someone's devotion for granted. But don't learn it with me." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see him processing my words, could see the exact moment when he realized I meant them. When he understood that no amount of begging or promising or dramatic gestures would bring back the girl who had loved him more than she loved herself. "So that's it?" he asked finally. "You're just going to walk away from everything we could have had?" "We never could have had anything," I said. "I was in love with someone who didn't exist, and you were comfortable being loved by someone you never bothered to know. There was no us to walk away from." He left that night defeated, shoulders slumped, looking like a man who had finally run out of people to blame for his own emptiness. I felt sorry for him, but it was the distant kind of pity you feel for strangers in news stories. It had nothing to do with me anymore. A week later, I heard from Mrs. Huang that he had quit the bookstore and moved back in with his parents. She said he seemed lost, like he didn't know what to do with himself now that his carefully constructed life had fallen apart. She asked if I thought he would be okay, and I told her honestly that I didn't know. Some people learned from their mistakes and grew into better versions of themselves. Others just moved on to make the same mistakes with different people. I hoped, for everyone's sake, that Kai would figure out how to be the former. 2 months after that final confrontation, I ran into Yuki at a coffee shop downtown. She looked different, lighter somehow, like she had set down a weight she'd been carrying for too long. Her hair was shorter, and she wore clothes that looked chosen for her own pleasure rather than to impress anyone else. "Arya," she said, seeming genuinely pleased to see me. "How are you?" "I'm good. You look happy." She smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen her smile without any shadow of sadness behind it. "I am happy. Or at least, I'm getting there." We talked for a few minutes about inconsequential things, her new job, my gallery, the unusually warm weather. But as she was getting ready to leave, she paused and looked at me directly. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For telling me the truth about him. About myself. About what love is supposed to look like. You figured that out on your own. Maybe. But you gave me permission to stop pretending it was enough." After she left, I sat in the coffee shop for a long time, thinking about the strange trajectory that had brought us to this point. In my previous life, Yuki and I had been rivals in a competition I didn't know I'd already lost. In this life, we had become something like allies, united by our shared experience of loving unwisely and finding the strength to choose ourselves instead. It occurred to me that this might be what healing actually looked like. Not the dramatic transformation I had imagined, not the sudden clarity that would make everything make sense. Just small choices, made over and over again, to value yourself enough to walk away from situations that diminished you. To love people who could love you back. To stop performing versions of femininity designed to make you smaller and more palatable to those who would never appreciate you anyway. I never saw Kai again after that night at the gallery. Sometimes I wondered if he had learned anything from the destruction of his relationship with Yuki, from the realization that his treatment of me had been cruel in its casual indifference. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. He had become what he had always been, a supporting character in my story, not the center of it. 6 months later, I met someone new. A painter who exhibited at the gallery, a quiet man with gentle hands and eyes that really saw me when he looked at me. He asked me about my thoughts on art and literature and life, and he listened to my answers like they mattered. He never made me feel like I was auditioning for his affection or competing for his attention. He simply liked me, openly and obviously and without reservation. The first time he kissed me, I realized I had never been kissed by someone who actually wanted to kiss me. All those years with Kai, I had been so focused on wanting him that I had never stopped to consider whether he wanted me back. Now, feeling genuinely desired for the first time, I understood the difference. It was the difference between performing and being. Between begging for scraps and being offered a feast. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about my previous life. About the woman I had been, so desperate for love that she had forgotten to be lovable. About the truck that had ended one story and begun another. About the strange mercy of being given a second chance to choose differently. I had been reborn once, literally. But maybe everyone got opportunities for smaller rebirths throughout their lives. Chances to shed old skins and become someone new. Chances to stop accepting less than you deserved and start believing you deserved more. Chances to love people who could love you back, in all the ways that mattered. The last I heard, Kai was still living with his parents, still working temporary jobs, still telling anyone who would listen about the great love he had lost through his own stupidity. He had turned our non-relationship into a tragic romance, himself into a reformed bad boy who had learned too late to appreciate what he'd had. It was a nice story. It just wasn't true. The truth was simpler and less romantic. A lonely girl had convinced herself that her obsession was love, and a selfish boy had been comfortable accepting her worship without giving anything meaningful in return. When she finally learned to value herself, there was nothing left to salvage. No great love story, no missed opportunities, no tragic misunderstanding. Just two people who had never really known each other, finally seeing clearly enough to walk away. I died loving him. I was reborn understanding that what I had thought was love was actually self-destruction dressed up in pretty words. And when I finally learned to love myself instead, everything else fell into place. He thought I was faking when I stopped chasing him. He was wrong. I wasn't faking anything. I was just finally, mercifully, authentically myself. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.